Hi, May here, and this is my hand-in for Advanced 3D. This video is divided in 4 parts. First, I'll show you the finished asset, and then we'll move on to the second part, which is the research and preparatory work. This will tie into the third part, where the texturing and experimenting starts, based on what I learned through the research. The last part is a summary and brief roundup, if you will, where I'll share my final thoughts on the new process, workflow, and software used. Alright, here it is, my end product, the finished asset. It's a low-poly hand-painted model of a bottle. I was inspired by Ryan Pocock's Manabottle on Sketchfab to make this. Credit of the original design and idea goes to him, just to make that perfectly clear, and you can find him on ArtStation and Sketchfab under the name Autumn Pioneer. Here you see the original. I did redesign the bottle a bit to make the idea into something more of my own. Researching. What I realized quite quick was that there are numerous ways to go about making hand-painted models. There are a few do's and don'ts, of course, but from what I could tell, in the end, most of it comes down to a matter of preference and what works best for you. But herein lies the problem. I wouldn't know what works best for me, as I haven't really tried many different options. I don't have a lot of workflows and techniques to choose from yet, so in between all of the artists and different techniques, I must be honest and admit I quickly felt like I was drowning. I didn't know what would work best. So I tried to keep an open mind and do a mixture of things I'd never tried before, and at the very least, I learned so much. Well, first things first. To lessen my own confusion, I asked myself a simple question. I'm making a hand-painted model, but what does a hand-painted model really look like? That's very important. And what gives it that hand-drawn, stylized look that I'm going for? Luckily for me, Jason Wang asked the same. He's a video game artist stationed in Singapore, and further information about him, as well as his portfolio and work experience, can be found on his ArtStation. Jason Wang focuses primarily on Photoshop when making hand-painted models, specifically talking us through how to make and identify a Blizzard-style hand-painted texture. I felt like I could not make a video on this topic without at least mentioning Blizzard-style textures, what for many has become a familiar staple among low-poly hand-painted models. At the very least, it's a very known style. He talks about how the textures usually has lighting, shadow, and AO painted directly into the albedo map, usually with key lights positioned above the object. Another characteristic is that there are usually very little or no straight lines, and dirt, damage, and cuts are often emphasized. The color palette also tends to be very rich, and edges are emphasized as well, with hard highlights. This, all in all, creates contrast and brings visual interest to the model. And to my surprise, he even uses the 3D feature within Photoshop to draw directly on the model, which I didn't even know was possible. So we'll be trying that a little bit later in the video, as well as painting directly onto the model while in coat, 3D coat. Which brings me to the next artist, named Angelina Diaz. She works as a 3D and texture artist at Ubisoft and is stationed in Barcelona, Spain. Her work is also featured on 80 level, which is nice. Either way, it was her workflow that piqued my interest. She uses a mix between Photoshop and 3D coat in her workflow. And at first, she generates a cavity and AO map from 3D coat. She then exports the map to Photoshop as grayscale color maps and uses them as a base for all texture painting. She goes back and forth between both software, Photoshop and coat, while working, and uses a combination of them both. And inspired by her, I will be trying a similar work method for myself. You can see that while she's in Photoshop, she masks out the different areas that she wants to work on, guided by the grayscale maps that she generated earlier on. And it helps her to work on the areas that she wants individually. And this seemed like a really nice and intuitive way to work, at least for me, as I haven't tried anything similar to this before. And the end result of her work, it came out looking really good. So that's one of the reasons, I guess, I decided to try a similar, not quite the same, but somewhat alike method for myself. I tried to find a golden middle ground, if you will. Well, the next and third artist uses a combination of Photoshop and not coat, but Substance Painter. Her name is Raluca Verdes, and she works as a 3D artist at Assist, a company in Romania that specializes in outsourcing software developing projects. More information can be found on their website. Either way, inside Substance Painter, she works with physically based shaders. And when I read that first, I thought, what? Because this type of map is usually for creating photorealistic textures with physically accurate properties, right? But in her case, it seems like she's merely using it to better focus on different elements and give each component of the model a different feel. For example, you can make a metalness map and tweak the reflectivity value, or just further enhance your albedo, normal, specular, gloss, etc., etc. There were many more talented artists and interesting techniques, like this Danish lady, for instance, working at Media Molecule in the UK. She draws line art inside the model at first, using Photoshop, and later on she uses Maya to make the line art outside the model. She has made a lot of nice looking stylized models, so please check her out. I really liked her style too and wanted to experiment and see if I could achieve a similar result just using 3ds Max, which I did in the end, and we'll take a look at that in the next part as well. Research-wise, I think this will do for now. I wish to include more, but I need time to show off the actual work as well. So now we will start the work and a little bit, or well, a lot really, of experimenting. For in a way, for me, that's what this project was all about, experimenting with new work methods, making mistakes and learning as much as possible. Alright, here you see the 3D feature within Photoshop. And to begin with, I just exported my model as an OBJ and dragged it directly into Photoshop. It's as simple as that, really. Now, I have a lot of different layers in this, but to get to the UVs, you choose the diffuse layer that you want, and for me, that's the layer inner bottle. The black outline is the outer bottle, so not that one. We'll talk about the outline later. But for now, just choose inner bottle. And you can even move your model around in here, which I thought was really cool, just like this. But yeah, for now, we'll just choose inner bottle, and then we'll go up and click the button beside diffuse. Come on, like the correct layer, make sure you have the correct layer, and then click the button beside diffuse and edit texture, and voila, you get your UVs. And to make the work more intuitive, divide the screen like so that you get both at the same time. And now when you hover your cursor over your UVs, you can see a corresponding cursor on your model too. And if you decide to paint on it, no matter what window you choose, you can see that it updates automatically in the other one. So now let's zoom in on my model, and let's say we just make a random blob on the cork here. Poof, it appears to the left. And now let's go into the left, do the same again. Poof, it appears to the right too. So this was really nice. Even on the sides, it works perfectly fine. And you can also tweak on all of these sliders in the 3D feature. Even choose between already made materials. Though, to be perfectly honest with you, I'm not sure what practical use I'll get from this yet, but it was still interesting to play around with. Just look at this pattern. Okay, alright, we're inside 3D Coat now. You can turn the wireframe on and off like so, and I dragged out and positioned my texture editor beside my model to make the work easier, and you can zoom in and move around with your mouse wheel and right mouse button. For this example, we'll make a new layer like this and just call it Experiment. Choose a brush you want, one you like. I chose this one. And yeah, you can also make your own color palette and import it quite easily to Coat, as you can see that I've done here. When I draw on the model, you can see that it updates in the 2D texture editor. And similarly, you can draw in the texture editor and see it working the other way around too, just like in Photoshop, however way you like it. You can play with the different parameters on the top shelf, currently belonging to the brush, to get different results depending on what you want. For instance, the first heart I drew has depth and the second does not. When I increased my brush size later on while experimenting with this, I realized the opacity was only set to 30%, so I increased it. And you get to see what the brush looks like with 0 in roughness and 100 in depth. Quite shiny and pretty, isn't it? But by reducing the roughness back to 0, you will get a matte looking color without shine. And to build upon that, we can remove the depth too, and you will get a flat color. Let's see. The first one has height, 0 roughness. The second has height, full roughness, and 0. The third one has 0 height and full roughness. So yeah. And to get all of this into Photoshop, all you have to do is press 2 buttons, Ctrl plus P, and you will move all of your layers and texture information to Photoshop. Again, I chose layer, inner bottle, that's where I have my diffuse, and voila, here it is. And you can see the new doodles that we just made as well. You can see that the experiment layer we made in coat is the one on top in Photoshop. Let's say I want to remove it. I make it invisible and I click save. I don't push any more special buttons. I simply go back to the 3D coat window. Poof, the doodles we just made disappeared. Now let's go back to Photoshop. I just click on the window and go back that way. I make another layer and I draw a few more doodles, like a smiley or a cloud. I'm not being very accurate, but that's beside the point. I'm merely illustrating an example. I click save and I switch windows again. Poof! The doodles that we made in Photoshop appeared in coat. I can make the doodles disappear in just the same way this time too. But now I remove the doodle layer in coat and I push Ctrl P again. And when I go back to Photoshop, I click update. And voila! Now, moving on to the black outline. I experimented with making it in coat as well as Max for a nice comparison. The first thing you gotta do is import your mesh, of course, but remember to this time import it for voxelization. And now in your layers or in your vox tree down to your right, you should always keep a copy of your original, just in case. You can make it invisible for now and not think of it too much. Name your mesh main. This will be your inner bottle with your diffuse. Duplicate it. This will be your outer bottle, your outline. And just make yourself a nice black material, like the one I've pre-made here. Now, we move the outline layer on top. And then we actually extrude it. Make it bigger. You can find the option by right-clicking on the layer. And it should be between radial array and thicken. Now, I struggled a bit finding the exact right amount for me. Something not too much, not too little. You just have to work a bit with it until you find what works for you. In the end, 0.25 seemed like a nice value for me and worked fine. Once that is done, you actually flip the normal of your outline layer. An option also found by right-clicking. Small heads up, I'm using the amateur version 4.8 of 3D coats. Anyway, it should give you a somewhat nicely looking black outline like this, but I didn't quite like it. And doing this in coat made me wonder if I could do the same in Max, and yes, you most certainly can, in almost the exact same way. Duplicate it again, name the layers accordingly, and make the outline layer black again. I added a push modifier to make it bigger, using the wireframe overlay just to see better. Once that's done, you flip the normals and voila. Activate backface cull if it doesn't show properly. One thing to keep in mind though when making outlines this way is that you are actually doubling the amount of polys, so do keep that in mind and consider it carefully depending on what you're making. Okay, now we are actually down to the last part of this video. We are nearing its end. And all in all, I enjoyed this project, even if it was a lot of back and forth. What I struggled with the most was trying to appreciate the new work method, because I didn't know much about it. What I mean is that I don't know enough to be able to appreciate code the same way that I appreciate Photoshop. There are, for instance, so many things that I'd rather do in Photoshop just because I already know how to do them, and that makes everything so much faster, right? But for this project, I denied myself that, and I tried to rely more on code. So, thinking positively, this method does have a few advantages. A good example can be when I tried to color the cork. There were two lines going from the top of the cork, which is its own island, and down on the sides. I drew the lines directly on the model in coat, and the lines showed up on the UV. And this way I knew there wouldn't be any weird clippings. caused by the cuts. I feel like I've barely scraped the surface here, but I'm afraid we've run out of time. For now, this is all. Thank you for watching.